Hello and welcome to episode 3 of On the Cube Leadership Podcast, where we look at everyday events in pop culture, in politics, in business, in ministry, and in the Bible to see how we can learn to become better leaders. I'm Craig O'Sullivan and welcome Dr. Rod St. Hill.
G'day there, Craig. It's great to be with you again.
It's always good to be able to share with you and also for everyone to be able to see the conversations that Dr. Rod and I normally have every week about this stuff. We just decided to do it online so you could be a part of the conversation as well. And also on that note, if you have any ideas or comments or thoughts about what we're actually talking about, feel free to chuck them down in the comments below. One of the biggest questions I get asked from leaders and people wanting to improve their leadership is all around how do we set culture? How do we create a good culture? How do we change a bad culture? Like culture is probably one of the biggest, I suppose, topics around, and I do that because it's kind of a bit of a buzzword as well around leadership, but it is so crucial. And so today we're looking at a number of different events that actually all kind of align with the theme of culture. Now, will every episode be one theme with different stories in it? Not always. It just seems that so far out of the first 3 episodes, we've been able to find a little bit of a theme with things. Maybe some might be a little bit of a stretch with the theme, but we won't intentionally do a theme every time, but if something jumps out at us. But let's get straight into talking about culture and let's talk about pop culture. And one of the, I suppose, actually it's kind of funny that it feels like it's only in recent times that it's this, popular thing about this, the woke culture. But you actually look back and it's actually, they've been talking about it and, conservatives have been fighting against it for a very long time. Now, once again, remember, we're not really political commentators, but there is something that we can learn as leaders from this woke culture or this, I suppose, resistance to and what's happening with. You've probably heard the term go woke, go broke. And while that's great on a bumper sticker and maybe good on an Instagram post, it isn't 100% true, but there are some examples of that in modern culture, in pop culture right now, that is showing that, well, there's coming a little bit of a backlash to this trend to push this, let's call it woke culture. And there's a number of examples that we can talk about, but the first one that I really want to talk about is, so of the Toy Story franchise. Well, you would have heard that there was a spin-off recently from Buzz Lightyear called Lightyear. And I don't know about you if you're a fan of it, but my wife and I are fans of Toy Story. Our child is 2 years old. Our son's 2 years old. And we were excited recently to be able to introduce him to Toy Story. He loved what, he had no idea what was going on, but he enjoyed watching the movement and colors on the screen. And we were excited because we started seeing this advertisement around Buzz, the spin-off, and we were looking forward to going and seeing the movie. Until we saw that it had this gay homosexual agenda, and that Disney's trying to push this intentionally trying to push this woke culture and sexual identity politics into their movies. We decided not to watch it ourselves and not to allow our son to watch it. Now, going on this theme of go woke, go broke, the movie actually cost them about $200 million, and well, it made barely anything back in the first weekend of opening. Actually, less than, it was their worst thing since Cars 2. Which made like 57 million or something like that in the first weekend. But that's been made as, it's been called a massive flop because people like myself have stood up and just said, you know what, I'm not for that. Dr. Rod, what are your thoughts on, first of all, an organization kind of choosing to go with this trend of pushing sexual identity politics and homosexuality and all that, this woke culture. What do you think about organizations trying to push that culture?
Well, I guess, as a Christian pastor, of course, I don't approve. Who would expect me to? But just having a look at the industry in general, with a company like Disney, of course, it's long been associated with producing entertainment for children and for families.
Mm-hmm.
And I think shifting out of that area is a major thing for Disney to do. And I just don't think it's gone down all that well with people who have supported Disney, because we know, for example, subscriptions to the Disney streaming service have dropped right away, and people are not even going to Disneyland in the same numbers that they used to,
yep.
Although perhaps COVID has had some impact there. So I think for Disney, which is really trying to push what ought to be adult themes, adult discussions within the context of entertainment, which is still designed for children and for families, was taking a very big risk, and it looks as if it hasn't paid off. I don't know whether they're going woke will actually send them broke, but it really should cause them to scurry back to the boardroom and have a really good think about just exactly what is the mission of the Disney Corporation. And look, I think the same applies to many, many other institutions. Large institutions, large superannuation funds, as we call them here in Australia, large financial corporations of all kinds, they seem to be bent on pushing what you might call a woke agenda. Some of us might refer to that as a cultural Marxism, and it's not going down all that well with a lot of people. The truth of the matter is that most of us are reasonably conservative.
Yeah.
Most of us are still influenced in our thinking by the Judeo-Christian ethic. Most of us are concerned for families. Most of us hold quite strong family values, even though we don't necessarily articulate those. So, look, I think Disney and other companies have probably actually read the market incorrectly.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing they might be trying to do is to lead public opinion. And again, that's quite dangerous, because they're moving outside of what I believe their mission to be.
Yeah.
And of course, that's always pretty dangerous for people in leadership to try to take their organisation outside of their stated mission.
Yeah. Actually, talking about that, there was a quote by Jordan Peterson that he said, I've actually got it written down, I want to read it directly. Maybe Disney and Pixar could concentrate on telling a story instead of distributing propaganda to children. He tweeted that out. So Jordan B. Peterson, an incredible lecturer and professor and psychologist, now becoming quite a massive influencer. That was a really good take. And I think that so the director saw in an article that the director was interviewed, and they're like, oh yeah, well, we're seeing that our team are all represented by all these different, sexual identity people, and we just wanted to make the movie representative of reality. And it's like, well, hold on a second. Disney is no movie is representative of reality.
Certainly not the Toy Story franchise.
Exactly. What's representative of reality with
Absolutely.
a plastic toy that runs around, that comes alive and runs around. There's no reality there. So I think it's funny how they're trying to, like, they try to twist their agenda into certain excuses. Look, I suppose here's the question I have for you is for us as leaders. We're talking about culture today, but specifically around this situation, it is very easy for us as leaders to, let's say, be influenced and be pressured by, well, like you said, most people are conservative. It does seem to be, what they call the loud minority, right? Like it's like the old saying of the squeaky wheel gets the oil kind of thing. Like it's actually, when you actually look at the percentage of society that want this woke agenda, it's actually very, very few, and actually very few of the left actually want it either. Like they're kind of pushing more central, or more towards the center. But how do we as leaders make sure that we avoid being influenced by, let's say, the loud minority? Now, it may not be over sexual identity, but in our organizations, in our workplace or whatever, it's very easy to be, pushed into a culture that is not of integrity, or making poor decisions, or not treating people right, or whatever that, let's say, poor culture is. What can we do as leaders to avoid being influenced by the loud minority?
Well, look, what I'm going to say is easy to say, but a lot more difficult to put into practice. You need to know what you believe and why. Yeah. And then you can actually stand up and make a statement. Then you can actually be a leader.
Yeah.
So it's really important, for example, in this whole area of, say, sexual identity, know what you believe and why you believe it, because then you can articulate it. And if you need to, you can actually defend it in the public square. But I think it really helps to know that if you do have an opportunity to defend your position in the public square, you're actually going to have a lot of people supporting you. It's just that you will probably never actually know of that support.
That's a good point. One thing I do with my clients is I make sure that we write down what our core values are, like culture statements, right? Our vision, our mission, and what our core values are, because you need guideposts to be able to. It's almost like a checklist. That's the way I like to see the core values, absolutely. Right? These are our core values, and this is what we make our decisions by, and so. Yeah, you're very right. How do you know what to? You can't stand against something unless you know what you stand for, right?
That's correct.
And so you just end up becoming, flailing in the wind, being blown and persuaded by everything that just sounds good if you don't have that set moral compass. Let me share a bit of an anecdote around, our family decided not to watch Buzz Lightyear. But let me tell you about let's say a loud minority. My son, right? 2 years old, a very loud minority. He is the smallest member of our family and yet the loudest. And he has built how would you say? He loves Blue's Clues. Right, I don't know whether you remember that show as a kid, but Blue's Clues, it's really good. He kind of got really engaged with it, and it was really good. And so we end up, he loved Blue's Clues, so we bought him Blue's Clues teddies. We gave him a Blue's Clues birthday party. He's got the Blue's Clues handy dandy notebook, and we bought him all the stuff because he loved it. And a bit of a side note, the first time I bought him a little plush Blue's Clues, I sat it at the door for him to open up when he came home. He cried and started freaking out because he thought his this TV character had come to life in his room. Right? It was adorable. Eventually he now sleeps with it every night. Now the challenge with that is he became so in love with it, and when he'd get up and he'd be like, Blue, he'd always want Blue's Clues. Whenever we were out, he'd grab my phone and be like, Blue, and until one day I happened to walk in the living room while he was watching Blue's Clues, and on the screen was a gay pride parade, a Blue's Clues gay pride parade, and the song was singing about all these families with two fathers and two mothers and all this, and I'm like, what is this? That it's a kids show. I trust this show to my son, and we've had to make we've made a conscious decision to slowly. Obviously, he's a child, so it's very hard to go, no, you can't watch it anymore. What I've done is I've gone through every one of those videos that have any questionable content in it, and I've reported them. So now they don't show up on the YouTube and all things like that. But we're now moving him away from something that he loves. He loves Blue's Clues, but we're introducing him to other characters and other shows and everything like that. But that's one really difficult thing as a leader of my family. He's very vocal. He wants blues. He's blue all the time. Like everything's blue. But now I've noticed that there's something not right about that. Now, does it cause problems? Does it cause friction in our household? Yes. But I'm making a stand because I know that I do not want him influenced with that stuff. Yes, later on in life, I'll sit down and I'll have the conversation when he's old enough and mature enough. But have you had any challenges with, let's say, counterculture to yourself in your organizations or whatever that you've had to stand against?
Oh, yes. Look, that's happened more than once. But just referring back to your example with your 2-year-old son, we had challenge when our own children were very young, which is a long, long time ago now. We had some rules in terms of television: no violence, no sex, no magic. And we used to actually watch a lot of television with our children.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes if there was a movie with a scene that we felt we needed to switch off, we'd explain to them why. So we basically saw nearly everything that our own children saw.
Yeah.
And they understood that the magic, the sex, the violence, that was something that we didn't really want to be introduced into our own family. And of course, as they got older, they did come to understand why it was that we had those simple rules. And of course, some people might look at this, well, that's far too simplistic. But look, for children, it's not, because they can't deal with all the nuances and the complexities and so on. But coming into my work life, I a number of times when as a Christian, I felt I had to speak out. And there was one example that I remember well, when in one organisation I was working with. I was fairly senior in that organisation, so I was in the senior executive team. We were having a meeting about a policy on culture. It was what was called a policy on multiculturalism. And there was a kind of value statement which boldly stated, we value all cultures. And the chair of the meeting said, oh, well, this won't be controversial. We might just put it straight to the vote. And I said, well, hang on a minute. I actually think this is controversial. I said, for a start, it's utterly impossible to value all cultures, because different cultures make competing claims. There are certainly some overlapping claims that different cultures make about, the value of human beings, perhaps. But there are also what you might call competing claims as well. And the examples I used were those religions where there was no separation between the state and the religion. Those cultures which embedded within them things like female circumcision, forced marriages, and so on. I said, we don't value those. In fact, in Australia, not long before that, we'd actually made forced marriages illegal. You could go to jail for forcing your daughter to marry someone else, and so on. So, I felt I had to stand up and say, no, look, this is actually nonsense. It's not good English anyway to value all different cultures. Now, the thing is, I said, look, there's a case to be made that we need to respect all people.
Yes.
Right? Now, that's very, very different.
Yeah.
Anyway, for the time being, they decided to shelve that. It was interesting, though. I was the only person in the room. There were probably 30 people in the room. I was the only person who stood up and said, no, I can't support this. I don't think it should go straight to a vote without some considerable discussion. And I knew there were other Christians in the room there, but they didn't speak up. They did come to me after the meeting and say, oh, I'm so glad you spoke up. And this is what prompts me to say, listen, you've got to stand up for the truth without expecting others to do the same.
Yeah.
For all sorts of reasons. And that's what prompted my earlier comment that the majority is likely to support you, but you're never going to know it.
Yeah.
Because they're too frightened to actually stick up for it.
Yeah.
So that's one example. That's probably the most glaring example, I guess, in my own business career. But there are other small things like that where I was acting as the CEO of an organisation, and some people had prepared a newsletter, and this newsletter was actually saying some pretty good things about the Black Lives Matter movement, and yet as a Christian organisation, I said, look, we can't support the degree to which they embody Marxist philosophy, because it actually runs counter to the values that we hold dear as Christians, and it runs counter to the wisdom of God. Perhaps one of the most valuable contributions Christianity has ever made to human history is that individuals matter, whereas Marxism say, no, it doesn't matter. What matters is class, and their analysis is all based on classes, not individuals. Yet the Christian message is that every individual matters and matters to God because they are God's creation.
Yeah, that's good. So you were able to stand up in that meeting and stand up because you knew what you stood for. So you were able to stand up and have the confidence. Now, there is one thing that I do want to kind of, let's put a condition, like a little asterisk against this, is I think that it's also important to know what we have been called to stand against. So knowing what you stand for is one thing, but like we quite often say, we're not political commentators. We don't want to get into the those conversations. They kind of come up, but we know that we're not called. There's amazing political commentators that are called to really wage war against the woke culture and everything like that. For us, we want to kind of maybe highlight it and see what we can learn as leaders. But we need to know what we're actually called to stand against as well. Know what we stand for, so you can stand up for, so you're not being influenced, but then pick your battles. We're not calling everyone to now just go out and grab a sign and start protesting out the front of whatever the next issue is that happens to stand kind of against what you do. Like, so for example, I mentioned about Blue's Clues. It was a video on YouTube. I just did what I could. I just reported it, and that's it. I'm not going to rage some major campaign against them or anything, because I know I'm not called for that. We can talk about it in this arena. We can share our thoughts and hopefully influence others to do the same. Hopefully you can, avoid your children from watching Blue's Clues or any of those other ones that have a woke agenda. But know what you're called to stand against. That's a big warning. But know what you stand for, so you can stand up for yourself and stand up for the culture that you're setting into your organization. Now, Dr. Rod, you mentioned something just then about classes, about how the Marxism talks about classes. That kind of leads us into our next topic, talking about classes, the top class of them all, I suppose, the Queen, right? Like she, in all classes, Queen always rules. Well, on the chessboard, the Queen rules anyway. We couldn't do an episode talking about influential leaders and talking about people that have influenced culture, especially, and not talk about the Queen. Especially considering now you're probably seeing this a number of weeks later, because we pre-record these a number of weeks in advance. So it's probably old news by now, but it just happened a couple of days ago. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II, and so we couldn't go by without talking about her, because there's so much controversy. It's amazing how many people have come out and used this as a way to trample and speak negativity about, I've seen quotes of like, well, she was a rapist, murderer, and all this sort of stuff, and just because the monarchy stands and all this, it's like she's a human being. Like let's look at that first of all, and she's made. Let's be honest, she's had a positive impact on the world, and so I was just talking to someone today at the gym, and they were like, "Oh, what do you think about the Queen dying? Like she was all this bad stuff." I'm like, look. Like she may have been a part of some things that weren't all that great, but a part of a system that weren't, but she definitely did a lot of good. And so we wanted to take this moment to, well, let's say honor her and pray that she's in a beautiful resting place, sitting at the feet of Jesus right now. Wouldn't that be amazing? I believe that she does represent something that would lead to that, I suppose. But I want to pass to Dr. Rod, but before I do, there was a section of an article that I read, and I've did a bunch of research about her passing and everything like that. And there was one thing that really stood out to me, this just little story of, you see this queen and she's the monarch and she's the, like representative of this negative culture and all this sort of stuff. But as a teenager, she served as a mechanic. As a teenager, she served as a mechanic in World War II. Now, at this time, I think she was already like part of the crown or whatever, or like, like she was at 16 or something like that when she was first, I'll pass to you, Dr. Rob, because you have all of the details. But, in World War II, she served as a mechanic. She drove a car and she was part of the war efforts. And then I saw this and it was amazing. She saved her wartime rations so that she could save up and pay for her wedding dress for her wedding. Now, isn't that amazing that the Queen of England, they have all this wealth, but even she was a person, she was part of the royal family, and I think even at that stage she was, in line for the throne or on the throne or whatever it was. But she still served and drove. And actually, I heard this crazy story that she took the Prince of Saudi Arabia, and she actually took him for a drive because obviously they're anti-women drivers. And she like you just hear the little stories, and you're like, she was more than just this queen figure that this prim and proper queen figure. She served. She served her country in war. And instead of putting a financial burden on the country and the financial resources of the country for her wedding, she's a princess and a queen or whatever, like that you're having the big royal wedding. She chose to save up her own rations to be able to pay for a wedding dress. Having the longest ever reign on a throne in history, over 70 years. That's absolutely incredible. Dr. Rod, what do you feel like we could learn from this? I don't know. I still see her as a little old lady, but she was a lot more than that. What can we learn from her in leadership?
Well, I think we can actually learn quite a lot. And I know some incredibly negative and absolutely ignorant comments have been made about her, which actually makes me quite angry.
Yeah.
Not so much that the statements were made, but some stupid people in the media thought they were worth actually broadcasting.
Yes.
But look, I have no doubt that she's certainly in heaven today. There's no doubt about that. She had a very deep faith. And look, I think one of the reasons why she was able to maintain her role for just over 70 years was because she had a very deep faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And a lot of the more sensible commentators who take a more nuanced view of history and the role of her as a monarch, they've made a lot of comments about how resilient she was, how committed to serving the people she was. Perhaps not many people are aware of how important she was in the instigation, the development and the continuation of the Commonwealth of Nations in this post-empire period. She didn't believe in empire, but she did believe in a strong Commonwealth of Nations.
So tell me about that, the Commonwealth of Nations, because, some people don't actually quite understand what the Commonwealth is. Actually, because there'll be people all over the world watching this, but even people in Australia don't quite understand what the Commonwealth is. So obviously England, colonized a bunch of nations around, but then obviously drew back the rule of the royal family, etc., but still maintained control. And what does that mean for all those countries?
Well, actually, they didn't maintain control. I think that was the whole point of this shift from empire to the Commonwealth of Nations. And the truth be told, it started probably after World War One, and that's when a lot of nations felt that they wanted independence. When we come down to World War II, the momentum, I think, increased. But my understanding is that Queen Elizabeth did not have a desire to see the empire continue. As a Christian, she believed in equality of all people before God. She didn't believe that one nation should necessarily, as it were, rule over others. And my understanding is that the Commonwealth was largely her idea. She worked very, very hard to establish it after she came to the throne in 1952. She spent a lot of time visiting the countries that are now members of the Commonwealth. And for her, it was something which was very important in her life. And she gave a lot of time and energy to the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is actually essentially a voluntary grouping of nations that have that common history, that the British either colonised them or they, one way or other, became a protectorate of the UK or Great Britain as we know it. Craig, I wonder how many people are aware of her actual title. And maybe you could indulge me and let me read it out. This is her
Please.
Official legal title.
Go for it.
Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. Now,
Wow.
she took all of those roles seriously, and she did believe that it was by the grace of God. King Charles III, as he now is, in his very first speech as the new king, he quoted from her 21st birthday address. And this is what he quoted. This is Princess Elizabeth in 1947 saying, "My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." And that was an address to the people. Now, he didn't say these important words, and I think it's a bit significant that he left these off, but she went on to say this: "God help me to make good my vow." So she was very well aware, and there was some untelevised parts of her coronation service where she was anointed with oil. She was prayed over by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the prayer was that the Holy Spirit would anoint her and empower her for this role. That was all done privately. She wore a simple white dress, no crown, no jewels, and she was anointed, as I said, and she was prayed over. She also spent nearly a month prior to her coronation working through a series of devotions and prayers that had been prepared for her by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So she really took this role very seriously. And lots of commentators have been able to reel off long lists of all her positive qualities. And often they add, and she was a woman of deep faith.
Yeah.
But actually my belief, and I actually preached on this just last weekend, my belief is that all of those positive qualities were the result of her very strong faith. Her faith wasn't just something we add to that list of qualities. Her faith was the very reason why she was able to exhibit those qualities over 70 long years as Queen Elizabeth II.
So we let's look, it's great to be able to honor her and be able to actually share, the good parts, etc. She had major influence. We have to admit that even though her role was more of a symbolic role, I heard a quote saying that she actually oversaw 13 prime ministers. Like imagine seeing that 13 leaders come and go, and you stay steadfast all through their controversy, all through their whatever. And I think it's incredible that, obviously on our theme today, talking about culture, obviously they were, she was actually part of influencing culture across the Commonwealth, and staying a positive culture throughout 70 years. No controversies, no mishaps. No, I mean, sure, there was probably some mistakes along the way, and there's lots of little things but there was so much controversy around her, and she seemed to just be this vessel of peace and tranquility, and even in her addresses and there's a couple of things that I draw from it that would help me as a leader to be able to, going on at what we spoke about previously, being influenced by, counterculture and things like that. One thing obviously you mentioned is her faith. Having a strong faith. We said, know what you stand for, like having a strong faith. Also notice that she never commented on political issues. She never, when there was all the issues with Princess Diana and Prince Charles and all those dramas, she never actually spoke up about them. Even in her address after Princess Diana died, she just focused on the positives about Princess Diana, not trying to bring disrepute to people. And it kind of goes back to what you said previously about just, loving people and caring about the individual. It seems like what I see is what gave her strength to last 70 years without major controversy, without, wavering and stuff like that, is obviously her faith. But also just staying in her lane, not getting caught up with gossip or controversy, or trying to force her way into the spotlight. Like you see all these people that are making comments and making fools of themselves and doing all this stuff to try to, force themselves into the spotlight, where she did none of that and yet stayed in the spotlight for 70 years. What's your take on those key attributes of, being able to withstand culture and maintain a strong culture?
Well, you mentioned a little earlier, Craig, that we need to know what it is that God wants us to stick up for.
Yeah.
We need to have a good idea, pick our battles. Those are the things that God has uniquely equipped us for and has called us to engage in them. And look, I think Queen Elizabeth II had a very strong understanding of her vocation. I've actually got a quote before me, and look, I've got this quote because I spent a few days preparing a sermon on Queen Elizabeth as a great example of somebody who had developed resilience. But Carl Truman, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, he wrote this very recently, actually. It was just about a week ago in a blog. A friend who once had the privilege of being a royal chaplain and spending a weekend at Balmoral Castle confirmed that the conversations he had with the Queen revealed her to be a thoughtful, devout Christian. As a humble Christian, she took her earthly vocation seriously, placing the needs of the office and of the people she ruled before her own. So I think for her, a really key thing was that she knew what her vocation was, and she really didn't step outside, if you like, the boundaries of that vocation. And I know this is a big thing for you. This is a big thing for me as well, in helping people understand what it is that God has called them to.
Yeah.
She had a firm understanding of what it was that God had called her to.
Mm.
And, our desire is that Christians everywhere would have a similar depth of understanding, because I can tell you what, when the going gets tough, if you know for sure and certain that you've responded to the vocational call on your life, you can put up with a lot. And you mentioned, of course, that there were so many controversies surrounding her family, even the role of the monarchy. 3 out of her 4 children ended up divorcing, and there was all kinds of publicity and scandal surrounding those. More recently, of course, Prince Andrew has been involved in all kinds of scandal. She didn't come out swinging in public about the criticism against her personally, or about criticism of the monarchy, because that was not consistent with her vocational call.
Mm.
But she did do some things that were remarkable that perhaps aren't reported on a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, she's the first sovereign that I'm aware of, certainly in British history, who paid income tax.
Really?
So even though she was queen, she did.
Wow.
About 30 years ago or so, she agreed to pay income tax, even though the royal family earned for Great Britain far, far more in terms of tourism dollars than they would ever cost the budget.
Mm-hmm.
But so she broke with a long, long tradition going over many hundreds of years. So she paid income tax because, by the way, she did build up a significant wealth portfolio in her own right.
Yeah.
So she was a very wealthy woman because of pretty wise investments that she herself had made. The other thing she did, which we were talking about before we rolled the camera, Craig, in 1970, when she was on a tour of Australia, she broke with tradition of hundreds of years. And as Queen, she just strolled with the people. So she mingled. And she was the first monarch ever to have done that, except perhaps during Second World War, when her important role models, her mother and father, walked among the ruins of London with the people. So there were times, I think, when she made very significant decisions that changed the nature of the monarchy, but that was well within, if you like, the boundaries of the vocation that God had called her to. But she was very scrupulous about those boundaries, and she just never went outside them.
And going back to what she actually said on her inauguration speech, that she's there to serve. She's there for service of people. And we as leaders, we have to have that servant heart. We have to go out intentionally, knowing that we are there serving God. And how do we serve God? We serve the people He's called us to lead. He hasn't called us to rule over people. He hasn't called us to, because if we want to rule over people, that's putting ourselves in a kingdom position, and there's only one person that should be sitting in that kingdom position. And it's amazing to see that someone can stay true to their faith, stay true to their convictions, and stick in their culture and influence positively the culture around them for 70 years, because she intentionally served people. She kept her mouth shut, like what, and I'm not saying that like keep your mouth shut, like she knew when to speak and what not to speak, and she held herself with integrity, and she had that incredible faith. And we as leaders can learn so much from Queen Elizabeth II, and thank God for her. Thank God for her ruling symbolically and leading the way and being able to influence culture so positively. I doubt there'd be very few people, well, there's not many people on the planet, let alone in history, that so many people would have such good things to say about this one person over such a long career. So, We pray that she rests in peace and that she is up in heaven, enjoying her time with Jesus right now, reaping the rewards of her service. Well, we all know she's not up there yet, but in her timeline, she's up there now. Well, it's really hard to kind of transition from that because it's such a beautiful story into let's continue to talk about culture and how we can influence culture from an organizational standpoint, from a business. Let's talk of the business field. And there is one organization that is influencing a lot of culture right now, and that's Meta. The organization formerly Facebook, obviously owns Facebook and Instagram and everything like that. And let's look at their culture. We know that they are renowned for not having the best culture. Obviously Zucks has done his recent tour and interviews to try to, polish the brand name a little bit recently. And it was every response that he gave was just so political and just so manufactured. And you're like, oh yeah, Robot Mark is back. But we've heard stories about how negative Facebook and Instagram is for especially our younger culture, right? Our younger generation. And there was some articles that were leaked a number of years ago that actually were done by internal teams at Facebook and found out and proved that their algorithm and everything was actually counterintuitive to mental health and mental health of its users. And it was obviously tried to be silenced and everything like that. And it came from one of their teams called the Responsible Innovation Team. And obviously they were put in place to try to combat the negative stereotype that their platform has and their organization has. And they try to improve the ethics and the culture of how it's operated and the organization is run. Unfortunately, we see a report recently where that team has now been not fired, but let's say dissolved, and those members have been moved into other areas of the organization doing other important works as Facebook reports or as Meta reports. But it kind of brings up this thing that we know that they've got this bad culture. We know that they have this bad influence. They had an internal team that kind of monitored their bad influence. They still didn't listen to that team and then eventually dissolved that team. And it kind of made me think of, corporate social responsibility. And we as leaders in organizations, there's this, obviously we have a responsibility to shareholders. We have a responsibility to our key stakeholders, our employees, our clients, our suppliers. We have responsibility to them. But in recent years, there's been this shift of focus to corporate social responsibility, our environmental impact, our community impact, and all those sorts of things. And it's funny that we as organizations can look after planting the trees and trying to decrease our carbon footprint and everything like that. But a company like this dissolves a team because they know that they are not socially responsible with mental health. Dr. Rod, how do we as leaders, now some people might be leaders in large organizations that are responsible for corporate social responsibility, but we may also be leaders in local churches, in small businesses, etc. How can we, or what can we learn from corporate social responsibility in our leadership?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. That is, I think to some extent, look, there was no talk of corporate social responsibility, say, in the first half of the 20th century. because managers understood that there was more to their business than making a profit.
Yeah.
And then there was a significant shift around about the middle of the 20th century, and a stronger and stronger emphasis began to be made on making a profit.
Yeah.
Until we sort of get down towards the late 1970s, early 1980s, when people started to think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe we're putting too much emphasis on profit. And that's when this idea of corporate social responsibility was developed, and a few articles started to appear in management magazines and so on. You can blame economists for the focus on profit, because there were some very famous papers written around about the middle of the 20th century saying that as long as businesses pursue profit, everything will be fine. You know, that's the best social goal.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman famously wrote a short paper in 1972 to the effect that, you know, the social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And certainly there are some theologians who would argue that today, that that's really what the focus ought to be. But it was a bit of an aberration, and we get into the 1980s, 1990s, and then into the 21st century, when we've said, well, look, large businesses in particular, what we call joint stock companies or public companies, they only exist because the people have given them social license. And in a way, that's true, because there was no such thing as the public company or the joint stock company or limited liability company until around about 1850, when it was the British Parliament that passed legislation that allowed a company to be established with a limited liability, which means the owners, the shareholders, weren't responsible for the debt of the company should it be wound up. And the most they could ever lose was the value of their shareholding. Now, that's had pluses and minuses, because it's allowed business to access very cheap capital, really. Yeah. Capital at zero price, because they don't pay interest. They just pay a dividend if and when they make a profit. So it's enabled enormous development, has probably contributed significantly to economic growth. But of course, what's happened, I think, with corporate social responsibility, that it's really been captured, again, I'm sorry to say, by the cultural Marxists. And now we're seeing large corporations actually wield enormous power in trying to push society in a particular direction. And I don't think that was the original intention of corporate social responsibility, which was all about businesses caring not just about profit, but also about people within their organizations and in the communities around them, and also about their impact on the environment. Now we seem to have an ethos that says the environment is just as important as the people, whereas, you know, God's got a bit of a hierarchy. Well, not a bit, he's got an explicit hierarchy in creation. We're given dominion, which we probably haven't exercised in quite the right way during human history. But I think what's happening now is that we're seeing large corporations act in ways which really are political. Yeah. And, you know, that they've really moved in and taken over to some extent the role of government. And I think that's a very dangerous development. Now, for those of us who are leaders within those large corporate structures or within big government departments and so on, it can be a pretty difficult thing, because you may find that there are clashes between what's going on corporately in the corporate culture and your own system of values and beliefs. Again, I think it's really important to know where you stand and why. But as Craig's mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean you've got to go in and battle against everything. You know, you need the wisdom of God, you need the nudge of the Holy Spirit to know when it is time to speak out, because obviously you risk losing your job. And so that can have devastating personal consequences. So know what it is that you believe in and why, and know for sure when and how you move, if you are going to move within the company to stand up against something, or whether you should, you know, just quietly withdraw. And I respect the decision that people make in these matters, because it is something personal between you and God. Now, if you happen to be the CEO, again, you don't necessarily have the freedom to as it were, impose your own system of beliefs because you're answerable to a board. But look, if you are in a position where you're the owner, you own a private company, for example, then I think you have a responsibility and, of course, the right as the owner to build culture.
Yeah.
And, culture is one of those things that really comes from the top down.
Not only the right, you're expected. Like that's what I teach people.
Absolutely.
Like it's not like you have the right. You must, because if you don't set the culture, someone else will.
It will. If you let it bubble up from below, you've got absolutely no control over how your culture grows and develops.
Yeah.
So it is something that has to come from the top down. And look, these days, even legally, in the case of large corporations, it's the board which is held responsible for the culture.
Yeah.
And the culture is not just about a few individuals here and there. The culture is something that is owned, it's contributed to by everybody within the organisation, but it really has to come from the top down. You've got to articulate that culture. Craig, you mentioned a little earlier in the matter of mission statements, how you need to include your values in those mission statements. And I think you're applying that in the context of both organisations and the individual.
Yeah. You
need to have your own mission statement. I wrote my mission statement out nearly 30 years ago now. It's due for a bit of a revision, but the fundamentals have never, ever changed. My basic values have never, ever changed.
Mm-hmm.
And look, that corporate mission statement, I think you should be able to put it on one page.
Yeah.
So, I've seen corporate mission statements that go page after page after page. No, get rid of it, because nobody is going to live by something that they can't internalise, and to internalise it, they need to be able to memorise it.
Yeah.
So I've always said short, sharp, and memorable.
Exactly.
One sentence statement about your vision, one or two sentences, no more, about your purpose, and then a list of maybe 5 to 7 key values. And that's where you start with culture, because then everything you do is judged against the stated values of the organisation.
Yeah.
And when somebody is behaving in a way which isn't consistent with those values, you need to pull them up and say, hang on a minute, that is not the way we do things around here. And you need to reinforce, as an owner, as a CEO, as a leader, whenever you see people doing the right thing in the context of those values, you need to reinforce it. As one management expert says, you need to catch people doing the right thing.
Yes.
And, positively reinforce them for that. So I don't know whether that answers the question, Craig, but look, it's a complex area. And I do understand that many of us in leadership roles don't have enough power to be able to change the values of a corporation or to change the culture ourselves. So it's not easy to be a leader in a large organisation, but you can be. You can develop what I call moral authority.
Mm-hmm.
People see your example and they will tend to follow your example. But I really do understand how difficult it can be for many of us in our leadership positions, because we don't have enough authority to be able to make the changes we'd like to make.
100% agree. There's a couple of things that I think we can take from this this meta situation. Is number one, if we create a negative culture and try to protect that negative culture for, like you mentioned, the old way of just pushing for shareholders, and that's the big issue of companies going public, they lose sight of their mission, and then it's just about the shareholders. Obviously the movement of like Jack Walsh, bringing in layoffs and everything like that, like that whole culture of stripping companies apart to be able to just make more money for their shareholders. It's funny how society or the community will tend to right a ship anyway. So Facebook have had this negative culture. They've disbanded this team that are responsible for making sure that they maintain a good culture or try to improve their impact. and yet they're obviously well known for having lost major share price. They're losing lots of money. Their ad revenue business is falling apart. And so it's kind of this. It's not comforting to know that they're failing, but it's reassuring to know that because people always say, but like, especially when it comes to leadership and things like this, that people are looking at it and they go, but that person's doing the wrong thing and they're really successful. And it's just showing that, yeah, people may be successful on the outside or maybe successful for a season, but eventually the wheels will fall off. Eventually somewhere in their personal life or whatever, the wheels will fall off. And we're seeing that in the case of Facebook. So I want to go like something really practical about this, because obviously Facebook set up this responsible innovative team, right? Responsible innovation team. Do you feel like it's worthwhile, and how would we go about as leaders creating some form of a moral compass, moral accountability in our organization?
Look, I think it's a good idea. I think for large organizations, possibly it's better to have an external body to do that.
Yep.
Rather than someone internal. They perhaps are able to say things that you might not be able to say as someone who's internal, for fear that, your division might be shut down and everybody dispersed elsewhere in the company. But whatever mechanism you choose, there needs to be accountability. Look, us human beings need to understand we're finite. We make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we do get a little bit too enamored by, say, making a profit over other considerations. And we need to be accountable to somebody. With the corporate model works properly when the board holds the senior executive team accountable to the mission statement of the organization. But I also think CEOs and, say, board chairs, they need, if you like, their own system of accountability as well. People who love them enough to tell them the truth. That's what I think.
Yeah.
With Facebook and the other social media platforms, of course, many of them did not start out as profit-making organizations. So they're a little bit schizophrenic in some ways. Facebook, of course, never did. Mm-hmm. It started out providing a platform, a digital platform for social connections.
Yep.
And it wasn't until a little bit down the track in its history that decisions were made to actually monetize those social relations. And I think one of the big issues that they've had to struggle with, and that other social media platforms have had to struggle with, is a model which was designed for one thing is now being used for something quite different.
That's good.
And I think when that happens, that's when you're really vulnerable to these misfires, if you like, of moral standards and so on. And I also think in the case of Facebook and some of the other social platforms, they are examples of what I referred to earlier as corporations actually moving in to the field of politics.
Yes.
And the particular field of politics that the big social media platforms have become involved in is free speech.
Yep.
And as we know, they tend to be censorious of views which some people might say lean towards the right politically, religiously, and so on. Now, I'm not very comfortable with the idea of corporations becoming political mediators. That is something which we really need to determine through the ballot box. That is through our votes for politicians, not our dollar votes for goods and services. And I really think this is an issue we've got to come to terms with as a society, Craig.
So we as leaders need to make sure that we're being held accountable. Like that we
the long and the short of it, simple.
Some sort of a mechanism.
Absolutely.
I mean, you and I've built a team around me to make sure that as we build the organization, as our leadership development program and everything that we've got running, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be the cult of Craig. I didn't want to have all the control, all the I wanted to be held accountable. So I set myself a team. I've got you as my pastor. I've got not only my pastor, but great experience in governance and in educational institutions. And, I've got intercessors. I've got corporate experience. I've got, I'm being covered spiritually. I've got a psychologist that makes sure my mental health is fine. That's my team to make sure that I'm being held accountable. And thank you for being a part of that, Dr. Rob. I think that we as leaders need to make sure that we have the right people around us, but also not yes men. No kind of let's kind of transition into our next story. That actually kind of brings us into our next point of it pains me. It pains me. Honestly, you don't know how much my heart breaks whenever I hear of a failure of a pastor or of a ministry leader. And unfortunately, I hope that when we talk about ministry leaders, we won't always be talking about moral failings. It just happened that an article popped up in my in my view in my research this week where I happened to come across that Pastor John Cameron, the senior pastor and founder of Arise Church, which is one of the largest churches in New Zealand. Sad to hear this report that there's an internal investigation against them. There's all this reported abuse, and I'll read the report. So New Zealand's largest mega church is being investigated by the country's Department of Internal Affairs following a damning report that the church commissioned but then refused to release. According to the 49-page report, there were egregious and systematic failures in the leadership of Arise Church. And it then went on to say that there was, in an independent review, that was conducted by Pathfinding, a Christian critical response management company, called for board resignations and new leadership to address widespread problems, including ill treatment of volunteers and interns enrolled in the Arise Ministry School. Now, Dr. Rod, obviously, we spoke about this previously, and you voiced what you just voiced just then about the accountability. What is it that you think happened, or what was the fault that led to this lack of accountability? Because they had a board, they had what, didn't they have it, and how did this still happen?
You ask pretty tough questions, Craig.
That's why we've got you, Dr. Rod.
You do. You ask pretty tough questions. Look, can I just say first, I personally do know pastors of very large churches, some of the largest churches in Australia, and they're men of great integrity.
Yes.
And they have surrounded themselves with people who do hold them accountable.
Yeah.
I've also mentored the chair of the board of elders of a very large church. This one, not a Pentecostal church, but one of the largest churches within that denominational stream. So I can say that it is possible to be the senior pastor of a very large church and do it well.
And I have to back up your I suppose disclaimer. Please, this is not a smear piece against Pastor John Cameron. My senior pastor, where we first met, was actually went through Bible college, has a good relationship with him and everything like that. And I know he is a good man. And I've met him a number of times and hung out with him and stuff like that. But please don't think that we're doing this as a smear campaign or anything like that. This is simply, I just wanted to take information from this public knowledge and obviously not knowing all the situation and just seeing what we can learn, how we can learn from other people's mistakes, not damning them or anything like that. So yes, it's a very good point, Dr. Rod. Sorry, keep going.
No, that's fine. Look, what this was leading to is that I do think that governance issues in the church world are very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Now, one reason is this: the senior pastor is both CEO and father, right?
Mm-hmm.
The senior pastor is meant to be the spiritual father of his or her congregation. Now, that kind of thing really doesn't exist in the corporate world, where the CEO, in a sense, is a very technical role.
Yes.
That's very different in churches.
Yeah.
So we have to be quite careful about simply importing a corporate model, like a business model, as it were, into the church world.
That's good.
I do believe that there are lots of dangers inherent in having the senior pastor chair the board of the church. Now, I do understand why that's done. And one of the reasons it's done is to protect the senior pastor from a rogue board.
Yes.
Right?
Which we've seen,
there are lots
happens.
of examples where pastors upset someone on the board and suddenly they're thrown out of their church.
Yeah.
And we don't want to see that either. That's just as bad as the kind of thing we've seen in the case of a Rise Church. My personal view, and I've been an observer for a long time, I have been on church boards as well, is that the senior pastor should not be the chair of the church board.
Yeah.
However, and this is probably going to be a bit controversial, I don't believe that the church board should have the power to sack the senior pastor.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with the board having the power to appoint the pastor, but I really do think there needs to be significant external advice or a significant role of the leadership, say, of the whole denomination or movement, as we often call the Pentecostal world.
Yeah.
They need to have a significant degree of involvement in the removal of a pastor. So it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
The other thing is that a lot of senior pastors are senior pastors because they have quite a charismatic personality.
Yes.
Now, that is a plus, no doubt about it. That's a plus. But also charismatic personalities have their downside because they can become overly confident in their own ability to hear from God.
Yeah.
And we end up with what I call the superhero leader or the major general leader, who essentially, the model is, I hear from God, I'm the leader, you're my followers, everybody falls into line, and you serve the vision. And I think that's what leads to the kind of what is labelled as abuse of interns in the case of a Rise Church, where interns are not well paid and sometimes they're not paid at all. And they actually undertake a lot of quite menial tasks, which probably don't contribute very much to character formation and certainly don't contribute very much to their spiritual development and to their spiritual understanding, their biblical knowledge and so on. So that's something that I think we have to watch very, very carefully in the church world.
So
a senior part,
because that's, Pastor John Cameron, there was a quote that says, look, I'm responsible for allowing this culture of performance, right? And you mentioned about the interns doing menial tasks and everything like that. I remember when I had my sabbatical, I was just doing menial tasks as well. I was just happy to serve at the church. Now, how do you? Because there is a place for just someone just having a servant heart, like I did, just having a servant heart, just pouring everything out, because around a church, menial tasks just need to get done. You don't have a big staff, like you've got the pastor and the assistant, and that's usually it in most churches. And the pastor's assistant probably works one day a week or something like that. And and then we expect the pastor to do house visits and hospital visits and prepare the message and lead the teams and organize everything. And, so there are things that do need to be done. And I must admit, I enjoy just serving and just doing the cleaning up the yard and doing the simple things. But how do we, because obviously the church culture is very much, around that serving and obviously serving the ultimate vision. How do we, number one, how do we in that culture manage ourselves to not, because most of those interns will be complaining now about abuse looking back, but in the moment they were probably praising the moment and saying it was an amazing time and whatever, because we kind of get ourselves caught up in that moment. How do we manage ourselves in that situation? And then how do we as leaders manage our team and prevent them from we still need the medial things done, but how do we stop taking advantage of people?
Well, you stop taking advantage of people. Look, I certainly don't object to an intern program involving some of those things, but it needs to be made explicit.
Yeah.
I've seen contracts for staff of churches where, Sunday you've got to be at church, you've got to do this, that, and the other, but it's not a paid day. Now, I don't even object to that necessarily. I'd like to see provision made to make sure that everybody in the church gets at least one day away from, the hustle and the bustle of the office and so on. So it's not really about whether or not people are paid, but I do think it's about whether or not there are reasonable expectations of people. The complaints that appear to have come out of the review of Arise Church really centre on the unreasonableness of what people were being expected to do. So it's important that everybody basically knows what is expected of them. So, I think if you're an intern, you can expect that you might be on toilet cleaning duty sometimes. As a pastor of a small church, it's my great privilege sometimes to unblock the one toilet that we have, right? And quite frankly, if I was a pastor of a large church, I probably would 2 or 3 times a year go and join the toilet cleaners and help them.
Yeah.
But obviously that's not something I'm going to be able to do every Sunday or every day of the week, because there are so many demands on your time. So you certainly can't do everything. But I think you do need to show that it's not beneath you, so to speak, to engage in some of those activities. So making sure that everybody knows what their role is, I think that's really quite important. Jesus was pretty explicit with his own disciples about what their role was.
Yeah.
And have a look in the book of Acts when there were some issues over the way in which the widows were being dealt with by the church, and the wisdom was that we appoint certain people to look after that aspect of the church's activities, while those who were called into the role of apostles actually got on with being apostles and spreading the truth of the message of the gospel and so on. So I think that's important. But what we've got to understand something, I think, neighbour love means that we have to treat everybody with great care, respect and affection, especially those who have said we want to serve, because they are quite vulnerable. And I don't know whether I can say a lot more than that, because every church's situation is going to be different. I know in my own church, ever since the day we planted our church in 2016, we've said every volunteer will be rostered off one Sunday. Yeah. So they'll only ever be rostered on 3 Sundays out of 4, or maybe 4 if there are 5 Sundays in the month. Now, I mean, my hope is that they'll still choose to come to church, but my expectation is that when they're at church, they won't have to actually do anything. Yeah. And I think that's probably a pretty good principle to employ. Yeah. in most church situations. And sometimes as pastor, you need to say to people, stop volunteering.
Yes. Yes. You need to manage their energy.
You need to manage their enthusiasm as well. And it's important for leaders sometimes to recognize that the people around them are burning themselves out because they are so committed either to the vision or to you personally as the pastor. And you need to say, no, I'm telling you, now is the time to take a little break.
Yeah.
And as a pastor and as someone who's fairly active within the wider church community here on the Gold Coast, my wife and I have made a commitment to ourselves that we won't allow ourselves to burn out. We're planning an overseas trip in May next year. It's a little while to go. We're also planning a short break in November. So that's in our schedule. We're not accepting commitments in that time. So we expect our people to organise their lives that way, but we also have to discipline ourselves to do the same thing, because the people who are our followers will follow our leadership.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't take time off, they won't take time off. So good. It is really important that we live what we preach, as it were, in this context.
Yeah, I think that part of the report, or actually the advisors then came in and said how they're going to try to fix this performance culture, is as they said they were obviously more focused on the mission of Arise rather than the mission of Jesus. And they said, we need more discipleship. And I think that that's the key to be overcoming that performance culture is, yes, you can have the team working on those medial tasks, but are you then also spending the time to invest in that team to help them grow? You know, it's kind of the core of OnPurposeCUBED, our leadership development program. Shameless little plug there. It's completely free, faith-based leadership development program. Check the link below. It'll be somewhere. But it all based around you need to be helping someone else grow. And you need to help someone while they're helping you mop the floors or empty the bins or whatever. Those things still need to get done, but are we helping them discover their own purpose and helping them thrive and helping them grow? Because if we're just using them and, you know, we unintentionally using and abusing them, that's the way it'll be interpreted. But if we are, okay, they're investing a little bit, I'm going to invest more into them, then they can grow, become better, and over time they can learn their purpose. They can grow into their position, into whatever position they are in the church, rather than just doing tasks. They can come and serve our vision, but we need to also help serve their vision, help them discover what their vision is and help their purpose and calling, and then help them rise into that. And so I think that that's part of our role as leaders to avoid that, especially like what, you know, John Cameron had faced there with the over abuse and this drive forward of growing the organization. They forgot about growing people. And so we as leaders have to remember we need to grow the people around us, not the buildings around us, not the tasks, not the accolade. We need to grow the people. And that kind of leads us to our last segment, where it's our leadership lessons from Luke, and where we look at biblical lessons to become better leaders. And I'm going to refer to Luke 11:42 because we're, you know, looking through Luke for the leadership lessons we can learn from Luke, because there's so many leadership lessons in there. Almost every verse has a leadership take on it, or we can interpret it anyway. But Luke 11 verse 42. Now this comes, I'm not going to read the full passage because the whole passage in the NIV is titled the 6 Woes. And this is, you know, Jesus is having dinner with the Pharisees and everything like that. And they're all, you know, they're all trying to vie for position and kind of kind of showing that, their position with Jesus, and Jesus calls them out as he normally does with Pharisees. And in 42, now there's 6 woes here, and all the woes are actually kind of on the same vein where, going back to our thing about culture, he's talking about you guys are just focusing on the wrong culture. You have this culture of performance, right, of doing the right things. And he goes through all the 6 woes about them, about their poor culture. But I want to look at 42 because it kind of brings to conclusion the things that we've been speaking about today. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone." They did all the right things. They performed, but they neglected justice or care for other people and love of God. And what is love of God? Loving people, right? He calls us to love him and then love others as we love ourselves. And so I kind of feel like, to wrap up our culture, topic, woe to you. Woe to you if you're trying to chase these accolades and try to do all the right things, but neglect justice, that care for people, that love, that all people are equal, that there isn't a hierarchy, although there is a practical, hierarchy. There is no hierarchy in importance of person, and no hierarchy in importance of purpose either. So we as leaders have to make sure that we are caring for people and not just trying to do all the right things. Dr. Rod, what's your take on the woes from Jesus?
Woe is me. That's all I can say. Look, I think that's a really significant verse, because we touched a little earlier on the whole issue of the difference between the business corporation and the church. The business corporation, largely, I guess I'm overplaying it, but largely it's all about technical relationships. You go to a board meeting in a corporate and you're looking at your balance sheet, you're looking at all the financial reports, you're looking at your marketing reports, you're looking at a strategic report and all kinds of things like that. That, in a way, is the tithing of the mint and the rue. Mm-hmm. But we in the church world, we've got to be very, very conscious that fundamentally we are disciples. Yep. And we're meant to be making disciples. Mm-hmm. Now, I sound as if I know a lot here, Craig, but just let me share something with you. I was kind of glad in a way that you didn't go on to read the next verse. Mm-hmm. Verse 43 of Luke chapter 11 says this: "Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces." And I've got a confession to make here that I've never made publicly. But look, it was only a few months ago that the Lord ministered to me on this. And I would have to say I was shocked, because he said to me, "Why are you still seeking identity in position?" Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. You could have floored me. Mm-hmm. But I had to look at my life and say, "Lord, you're right. You are right. I want people to recognize me. And yet, I know in my head that this is not God's way." Yep. That I need to serve my vocational calling. Mm-hmm. I need to serve him. I need to serve others without looking to build my identity on the recognition that I receive from others.
Well, he does. The word does say, for those who seek the reward and accolades from man, he's received his reward.
You got him. That's it. Paid in full.
Paid in full. Done.
But I think we just have to be so aware that, we can read these passages and say, "Oh, I'm glad I'm not like the Pharisees," but actually we are.
Very much so.
And we do have to guard against it. And as I say, if you happen to have a charismatic personality, you need to doubly guard against it.
Yeah.
Because you will attract people. People will love you. People will seek to serve you. And eventually you might come to believe you are the person they think you are.
Yes. Yes. Which
and
is
then
the biggest
that can
mistake.
lead you to these excesses,
Mm-hmm.
for example, of that very heavy emphasis on performance, of growth in the church. And look, we in the Pentecostal movement, we're quite susceptible to the idea of growth.
Yep.
The reason is a good reason. It's
Mm-hmm.
because we are strongly driven by a need to see people saved.
Yeah.
And the theological reason for that is that we hold to what they call the doctrine of imminence.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any Pentecostal movement that exists today that doesn't say Jesus is coming back without warning.
Yeah.
And that's what motivates us to focus so strongly on salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we sometimes then neglect is discipleship, which is the point that you raised just a few minutes ago. And so we can build our whole church around, as it were, getting people saved.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want an environment that is attractive to people whose only experience is with the world.
Yep.
They haven't been introduced to Jesus.
Yep.
We get them in. We bring them to the point where they say, yes, I want to become a follower of Jesus. Then what we tend to do is get them involved as volunteers, because that engages them in the church. And that's a good thing. But then we can go on, come along and be an intern. And suddenly these people find they're vacuuming the carpet, they're cleaning the toilets, they're driving the pastors around, they're going to the airport to pick up a guest speaker, and they're not being discipled.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we've really got to ask ourselves is, as leaders, are we disciples?
Yeah.
And are we discipling others? As churches, are we a church of disciples?
Yeah.
Discipling others?
Yeah.
If we're in business, as an entrepreneur, am I a disciple, discipling others?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of these things, that's the difference between tithing, the mint and the rue. That's a good thing.
Yes.
Do it.
Don't neglect
but
those.
Don't neglect these other things. So do the salvation thing.
Yeah.
Do it. It's necessary, but don't neglect the discipleship. And that would be my plea to leaders everywhere, no matter where you are, whether you're in church or a leader in the business world or in a government department or in a voluntary organisation, a charity or something like that, wherever you're exercising leadership, just be sure you get all that technical stuff right. You've got to make sure the budget balances.
Yes.
You've got to pay the bills on time. You've got to adhere to the maintenance schedule. You've got to follow all the regulations. That all matters, just as tithing the mint and rue matters. But don't neglect these other things, and in particular, don't neglect discipleship. And I know, Craig, this is your heart. I know you seek to disciple people, and you've surrounded yourself with people who disciple you as well. And obviously, it's my privilege to be one of those. And you and I have had some pretty hard conversations in private, and of course, that will always remain in private, because you have invited me to become one of those who disciples you.
Yeah.
And honestly, I need it. I had coffee yesterday with another pastor. He probably doesn't see himself as discipling me, but he is discipling me. I have a senior leadership within the context of the Ignite Life churches of which we're part. My senior pastors stayed with us for a week just recently, and they hold us accountable.
Yeah.
And that's so important. It doesn't matter that I've been around for a long time, that I'm a senior this or a senior that I've been I'm an emeritus professor, all of those
or whatever.
things. I've got, all those letters after my name. But you know what? As far as God is concerned, I'm no different to anybody else. He loves me no more, no less than anybody else. He seeks to grow me no more, no less than anybody else. And I know that his heart for me in whatever ministry environment I happen to be in is that I be a disciple and that I disciple others.
That's great. Look, the Woes leadership lesson from Luke this week is the culture. Are you building a culture of just performance, of achievement, or are you also building a culture of caring and loving for people, build people and the business, build people and the ministry, build people. Got to love people, got to build people, got to encourage people. You got to invest in the people and help disciple them. And another quick shameless plug: if you want to know how to disciple people better, or if you want to have your people go be discipled through our program, we have a free faith-based leadership development program that's available for you. But Dr. Rod, thank you for your advice, and I can't express enough gratitude for you sharing your wisdom. And I hope that you guys were able to learn something from this, and I hope that we've shifted your focus with now learning about all of these different spheres of the pop culture world, of the go woke, go broke, of political realm, of the passing of Queen Elizabeth III. In the business world of Facebook trying to control their, trying to skirt their corporate social responsibility. In the ministry world of Arise Church, unfortunately focusing on performance culture rather than building people. And obviously our leadership lessons from Luke. And if you've enjoyed that, please, if you've got any questions, any comments or anything, we'd love to hear what you've got to contribute down in the chat. And if you want to hear more of these, we're going to be releasing one of these every week. So make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. It does really help us out, and we would be eternally grateful for you with that. So once again, make sure you're building people and build a culture of loving and caring for people. Have a spectacular week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Dr. Rod, once again.
God bless you, Craig. Thank you so much for the conversation. I really do appreciate it.
Great. Bye, everyone.